Sometimes you can look at something and see it's a terrible idea. I didn't have to wait for the reviews to come in to realize cats would be a cinematic penance. That the Cleveland Browns trade for Deshaun Watson was not a sober decision. Or planning to use a computer to spit out new material using your past works without the help of human intelligence is only going to end in tragedy. That brings me to the last part of my series on the Northern Reaches, with the unification of the Soderfjord Jarlsdoms, or the attempted unification, because that nation is easily the least stable of any country in the known world. War leader Ragnar the Stout has plans to turn the Jarlsdoms into a real kingdom. But right now, the kingdom is so disjointed it makes the fractious principalities of Glantry look like the Undertale fandom. Welcome to Mystara. I'm Mr. Welch, and if you ain't got a ting, if you ain't got that swing. The problem with Soderfjord is it has no central government. It's a nation comprised of 29 different regions, all of which have an equal voice in the government. Voice is the wrong word. Veto is the better term. If you want to change a law in Soderfjord, all 29 yarls must agree. If just one votes against the proposal fails. If a yarl agrees to a proposal but doesn't want to apply it to his domain, he doesn't have to follow the rule. The defense pact the yarls have established is primarily case by case. If one jarl wants to go a Viking, no one else has to help him. If a jarl is attacked, everyone is supposed to come to his aid. But even that rule is treated more like guidelines. However, if another nation attacks Soderfjord, the jarls have always united against the common foe. That reason alone is why Soderfjord still exists. The power of the single veto is one of the most significant issues Soderfjord struggles with because, without a way to force jarls to enact popular but necessary laws, the nobles will never solve the mounting problems. It doesn't help that the jarls are notoriously self-centered. They do what is best for them and to blazes with their neighbors. They try to act aggrieved when their actions directly harm their fellow jarls, and then try to put it off as they're the ones being targeted. So when a jarl decides to raid a nearby nation and bring the entire navy back seeking revenge, he's not going to be the most popular person in Soderfjord for a while. Jarls have dammed rivers that have starved other domains of water. They've started border wars with other nations that, of course, spill over into the surrounding jarldoms. A prime example of this is the Soderfjord, a wall protecting the country's southeastern region from the gnoll raids that plague it. The entire nation would benefit because the gnolls don't stop at the border on successful raids. The jarls agreed that the wall was needed and voted to build it. But most of them whose domain wasn't adjacent to the affected region opted out of paying for it. This left the Soderfjord the responsibility of just a few jarls, most of whom couldn't afford to finish the wall with their limited resources. If the jarldoms had shared the wealth, then the wall could have been built at little cost to each individual noble. Instead, it remains half-built, far beyond schedule, and has little chance of being finished in a reasonable amount of time. It doesn't help that the various lords of Soderfjord have long been known to be influenced by foreign powers. Jarls often take coins from other nations to promote their patrons' interests. If Theatis doesn't want the jarls to trade with Alphatia, it just takes one vote to veto the idea. Many jarls are sympathetic to Ostlin or Vestlin, seeking to join with the more stable nations in the future. Several domains of Vestlin were once loyal to Soderfjord. The jarls that want a stronger central government are constantly thwarted by those who only seek power for themselves. It doesn't help that many ruling families are involved in blood feuds with rivals that date back centuries, and a few don't even remember the original slight. They just know that they've always hated their rival, so they will continue to hate their rival. These feuds have caused the nation an inestimable amount of harm as jarls vote for universally harmful policies just to harm a rival. Soderfjord has many of the same problems that people brought up in their criticism about Radiant Citadel, only taken to a more realistic level. It's easily the most fragmented nation in Mystara, with the laws requiring a unanimous vote to pass anything, and the various jarls can hold out for concessions. This will backfire when one jarl is holding out for something that will hurt a rival with the same veto power. There's no way to override a veto, so if a jarl doesn't want to be taxed to pay for increased military spending, there will not be an increase. To hammer home the point, you have multiple jarls who take excellent care of their domains and can be used as a measure against the more self-serving ones. The previously mentioned Soderfjord is planned to stretch across as many as 7 domains, but the only jarl providing money and men to the project is Vandred Horikson of Soderfjord. He lacks the funds to complete it entirely, and he doesn't have the manpower to fortify it, but at least he's making an attempt. The wall in his lands is only partially complete, and has a skeleton crew in many of the watchtowers. But as a result, the gnolls are avoiding his domain and attacking his neighbors because they have even fewer defenses. Even his incomplete wall has already achieved success, but his peers are too short-sighted to see that. Another major example is the Soderfjord military. According to the laws passed in the Commission of the Nordhardt Defense League, the jarls are to make available 2,700 warriors comprised of 3 units of 900 each. The forces will muster in the forts of Blackwater, Castellan, and Morden, where they will be under the control of the war leader. The The problem is, only Castellan has completed its fort, with Halfdan Greybeard of Morden and Ceolwulf Wartooth of Blackwater unable to complete their fortifications due to a lack of money. The other yarls consider the task of building the forts the sole responsibility of the local leaders, as they're gaining power and prestige from hosting these armies. Raising the funds required to complete the forts has been left to the men who volunteered to shelter the troops. To make matters worse, the probability of the yarls actually donating the troops needed to bring the army to full strength is doubtful, as many of the nobles believe the troops will be used against the enemies of the garrison commanders. Worse for the nation is there's a jarldom within it that showcases what could be if it wasn't so self-serving. Solvi Hardhand of Castellan rules his domain fairly, has traded openly with Yalarum, and has given the dwarves living there full rights as citizens. He's increased migration to his territory from the other dwarves in Soderfjord because of his welcoming attitude. Because of this, his territory is the richest in the nation, and the city's well-designed buildings reflect that. Hardhand's success hasn't been lost on his jealous rivals, who try to sanction him at every chance. But fortunately for Castellan, he's not afraid to use his veto power to protect the advancement his lands have made. But unfortunately for every Hardhand or Horixon, Soderfjord has two of Guthorm Brittlebone, Jarl of Ranwood. His family is an old one, dating back when Aslan ruled Soderfjord. He still lays claim to surrounding areas that were once part of his family's heritage, seeking to reunite them with his personal domain. One such place is the town of Vanger, now led by Clan Bornbank. Brittlebone has attacked the city repeatedly to try and conquer it, with varied success. The Jarl of Clan Bornbank, Roltolf Kalfsson, has warned that another attack will result in all-out war. The problem is that Bornbank is in Vestland. Kalfsson speaks with the full authority of King Gudmundsson and will respond with a large force of Vestlanders. Brittlebone's forces consist of just the men he can muster. The Vestlandic troops will overwhelm his meager garrison and might not stop there, much to the concern of Brittlebone's neighbors. One irrational jarl holding on to an ancient grudge could very well cause the destruction of a portion of his nation because of his actions. The worst part is he's not alone in his behavior. The jarls would rather bicker amongst each other than help the nation. Soderfjord has started trying to reverse course. At least some of the jarls have. Ragnar the Stout, the man appointed to lead the nation's army, is a charismatic jarl who believes that as king he can change his country's fortunes. The more successful jarls back him. He's doing his best to bring the more traditionalist jarls into his way of thinking. Ragnar can handle the indecisive ones. He has a way with words and is not above browbeating weak-willed individuals over to his side. He's a good man, at least what the northern nation sees as a benevolent leader. His issue is naturally the nobles who see him as a threat to their power. They won't budge an inch. His plans for success will depend on whether he's willing to remove those nobles from power with something more permanent than words. Unfortunately, Soderfjord has other factors preventing it from creating a strong central government. The place where Soderfjord's governmental problems will be resolved is the Ting. This is an annual or semi-annual meeting of all the jarls, depending on the nation's needs, where laws are proposed, disputes are settled, and problems are addressed. It's often a wild and chaotic affair, as a Ting where something actually gets accomplished is a rarity. For Ragnar to become king, as he desires, he has to convince all 29 jarls to give up executive power without demanding excessive concessions. The army needs to be funded. The Soderwerk needs to be built. A king can make those decisions with the authority given to him, but the Soderfjorders value independence more than probably any other nation in the known world. They agree to some government, they aren't an anarchy, but they're leery of anyone more powerful than the local lord. In Canon, Ragnar is named king in 1012 because of a single moving speech, and everybody throws their support to him in one brief mention in the timeline. Then he gathers 2,000 troops and marches on Falun's kobolds, despite them outnumbering him 50 to 1. And then the story of Soderfjord stops. There's a lot of problems with this chain of events. First, it doesn't deal with the external elements, which keeps Soderfjord dysfunctional. Brittlebone will not agree to a king under any circumstances because that cuts into his power base. Many jarls would prefer to cut off their nose to despite their face. The king-making speech wraps up the storyline far too conveniently. In the 1005 timeline, Soderfjord is conquered because of its fragmented status, but we're not using that timeline. We're trying to keep with the 1010 one as best we can. Ragnar must decide whether to remove the poisonous elements from his country if he's going to become king. If he starts killing off his rivals, obviously he risks civil war. He would need to pressure them to get out of power or find something to bribe them with, which won't be easy. His position as war leader doesn't give him any more authority outside of just being the army commander, and even then the army is never at full strength. He also has to deal with foreign agents from Ostland, Vestland, Theatis, and similar who keep certain jarls under their influence, often with coin. He could threaten to expose these as traitors, another risky gamble, but the odds of modernizing Soderfjord into a unified nation without bloodshed are slim to none. He could ally enough jarls to his position to force the holdouts to agree, or use his allies to crush one of the more objectionable rivals in a show of force. Soderfjord is a land born of fire and blood. Turning it into something stable is going to require copious amounts of both. That concludes the extended look at the future of the Northern Reaches. Ostland is dealing with its internal crisis right now with the Regency. Vestland has become successful because they've already finished their trial by fire with their revolutionary war from Ostland and their restructuring. Soderfjord hasn't even begun to face its biggest trial. The nation's distrust of a strong central government coupled with self-serving nobility makes for a poor foundation to build a successful country. Next up, I'm going back to cross more monsters off of the list of ones I've done already, with the hybrid species of Mystara. The game designers had a strange obsession of taking two creatures and merging them into one. Some creatures were awesome, and many more just raised eyebrows. Until then, remember, Lord of Plants got a Nulf,